Blessings to you. My name is Nigel Daring, author, originator of the philosophy of Darinism or Darinism. Um, it's a philosophy based upon my analysis of Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3. And the way I analyze those pages, you get to see that those pages represent reality, represent existence as we know it. Um, I've done 17 videos prior to this one. I hope you'll check those out. Um, Today, what I'm going to do is look at some misconceptions some ideas that people might have that might lead them to not want to view Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3 or Genesis 1 and 2 as real. So I want to clarify these misconceptions and so that we can get a better understanding and appreciation of those pages. All right. Before I get into that, of course, I'll do some review um, of what we discussed last time. Um, Now, of course, my philosophy is hashed out in my book, Existence, God, Man, Society, and Nature, which is available at www.amazon.com. You can type in the name of the book, or you can type in my name, Nigel Daring, and you'll see 16 books come up. At this point, it's 16. You can pick any one, but this book is there: Existence, God, Man, Society, and Nature. All right. Just so you're warned, just in case it happens, sometimes my computer does skip abruptly while I'm speaking, just skip slides. It is not my intention, but if it does happen, whatever slide I'm on, I will get to it, but I will finish the discussion that I was on previously. All right, just in case that happens. Also, I just want to point out that I made a mistake last time when I was pointing out that the idea of heaven, the place of paradise, um, I had said it was, it's pointed out in the Bible, and I said it. I pointed out that that it occurred in the Bible again, not just in Genesis, but I said it was Genesis chapter 22 verse 14. I actually meant not Genesis, Revelation chapter 22 verse 14, where you see this idea of the paradise, of the garden, of that is God, and where you see the idea of the tree of life being mentioned again, being associated with paradise, and it's the place where the angels are and the righteous, and outside of it, outside of this garden, this heaven, outside of that paradise is where you have hell, where you have the sinners, right? That are described in some unflattering terms. So so I really meant to say Revelation chapter 22 verse 14, where you see that appearing again in reference to the garden and the tree of life, and who gets to be in there are those that obey God and worship Him and that sort of thing. All right, all right. Well, let's move on to today's. Let's do the review first. So last time we spoke about vice and virtue, right? We said vices in primitive culture, which we'll use Adam and Eve prior to the fall to represent. Vices there become virtues in civilized culture, which we're going to use Adam and Eve after the fall to represent. And we pointed out that that's not exactly accurate characterization. Adam and Eve prior to the fall to represent primitive culture isn't exactly accurate, because primitive cultures have themselves been tainted, and they aren't perfect moral enterprises, but they give us an approximate idea of what life could be like if Adam and Eve had not sinned. And then civilized culture, Adam and Eve after the fall, to represent civilized culture isn't quite accurate either, because Adam and Eve after the fall never really engaged in um, what we describe as a massive something, any enterprise that's massively civilized, but they had a, there was a notion that they introduced into existence that was to be capitalized on for civilization to develop. All right. So vices in primitive cultures become virtues in civilized cultures, and specifically, we spoke about we spoke about clothing, ambition, diligence, and the quest for knowledge. In primitive culture, clothing would be a vice, because in primitive culture, the whole idea is that you're not ashamed of yourself, right? You're pretty much like the other animals in nature, and like all nature, which is unashamed of its being. And so you don't need to clothe yourself. There's no insecurity. You're not supposed, or there minimal insecurity. Um, so clothing is inappropriate in that existence. Clothing is for the state of shame that's relevant to civilized existence. All right. So clothing is a vice in civilized, in primitive existence, that where the whole idea, whole existence is based upon an acceptance of self, and upon an acceptance of nature, and upon an acceptance of your nature. All right. But in civilized existence, clothing becomes a virtue, because um, the lust of flesh becomes relevant in civilized existence. It's relevant. It's the lust of flesh that brings man into that state of reality, and into the and it's there's an ego that that the lust of flesh, um, the ego predicates itself upon the lust of flesh. But the lust of flesh itself, if engaged properly, will subvert the ego, this false ego that man is after. So clothing becomes appropriate to sort of tamp down on this lust of flesh, to sort of contain it somewhat, so that you don't forego the ego in in lusting after flesh. Also, it addresses the shame, the sense of shame civilized man feels, because in taking on flesh for existence, man is rendering himself insecure, because he's chasing after another sense of self. So whatever state he is in, he's insecure in that state, because he's imagining himself complete in some other way. And so he becomes insecure in himself in taking on flesh, and so that's insecurity, which translates to shame. Now, clothing sort of addresses that. Is shame about himself. Now he has to put on clothes to sort of um, to address that, because he's not proud of who he is. He's not proud of just walking around naked again and unashamed. He now in a civilized mode of existence, he has to put on clothes. But clothing is also appropriate in civilized existence from God's point of view, not just man. Man needs clothing not just to address the shame, and not just to tamp down on the lust so he can chase after his false ego. So clothing becomes a virtue in his perspective from that standpoint, but clothing also becomes appropriate from God's standpoint, as we pointed out in the Genesis story. After they sin, you see God putting on coats of skin on Adam and Eve, because clothing becomes important, because the lust of flesh is what distracted man from God, uh, to sort of give him some basis for his ego. And so in order for man to get back to God, he has to tamp down on the lust of flesh, or even not lust after flesh, so that he can focus on his spirituality, right? And spiritual understanding, and get to see God. So God knows that he has to put on clothes so that he can get to refocus on him. And so the new morality then, once man falls into a state of flesh, and as his innocence is corrupted, he has to put on clothes. All right. So in a sense, clothing signals for both the evil man chasing after his ego and for God the good, that it serves a higher purpose. That there's some higher thing to be be focused on, not just flesh proper. Now, ambition is a detriment in primitive life, because in terms of the structure and order of society, it is based upon accepting traditional roles that are sequenced within the frame and structure and order of the society. An ambition to move outside of your role and outside of the role, this actually collapses and degenerates the society. And indeed, that's, I'll argue later on that it was that's what sort of collapsed primitive culture to sort of to start pursuing civilized existence, when man started conceiving of himself outside of what is tradition. And a lot of that is psychological. That's all psychological deficiency, of course, with the ego that's involved. And then there's the emotional breakdown that's involved with that. But in any event, an ambition in primitive culture or indigenous society, and remember, when I'm using primitive, I'm not using it in any derogatory way. In fact, I think primitive culture is more honorable than civilized existence in a lot of ways. But having ambition in primitive culture would disrupt the society. The whole idea is you accept the order of the society, and you function in the given roles that are prescribed for you, because ambition outside of those rules becomes disruptive and will degenerate and degrade the society. Now, in the framework of civilized existence, where you do have that existence by definition is based upon ambition, chasing after this ego. So the idea of ambition, of wanting more and better, becomes a virtue in that state for man. It is also right for the evil man who's chasing greatness and glory. Ambition becomes a virtue for him. It's also a virtue for God and and man that he created in this realm of existence. The ambition then is a virtue in terms of expressing yourself more and more, better and better. Not the ambition to move away from yourself, because that in itself is a problem. An ambition to be some other self is a problem. That's evil man's conception. And in civilized existence, he's going to find virtue in that. But ambition for a good man who wants to serve God would be to manifest his gifts, his natural gifts, and to express them more and more, and to take advantage of all the opportunities that are available to him in that civilized realm, as much as are available, to take advantage of them to express his natural talents, which is basic expression of his God self. Because to express your natural self is to express your divine self, because man was made in the image of God. All right. Now, diligence, hard work. In primitive society, that's an affront to primitive society, because the whole society is based upon existing at one with nature, at peace with nature, at peace with yourself, and living a relaxed lifestyle. Right? You don't work by a clock. You work at peace with nature. You watch nature. You respect yourself, your body, its needs. You move when your body feels the impetus to move, and when the rest of the members of your tribe feels the impetus to move, and it's an organic sort of movement as to what it is you're going to do, and and how you're going to get food from nature. You're studying the rhythms of nature. You're in tune with it, and you go secure your food. or and your shelter. So there isn't diligence is unnecessary in primitive existence. It's also an offense, really. But in civilized existence, diligence is important, and it is a facet and a feature of civilized existence. Now, the evil man in it's in civilized existence, diligence for him is working hard to get to achieve this great sense of self, to get more and more and closer towards that sense of self that he cites to as his personal glory. Diligence for the good man that who wants to who is living, who wants to serve God, would be to work hard to express the talents and gifts that God gave him. And you can't, that man can't exactly be quite relaxed and easygoing when the world around him is sort of moving on a clock. On a time basis, on this artificial sense of time that man creates to regulate his life. So diligence becomes important for him to keep up with that. When opportunities are available, more likely than not, they're going to be available in the realm of that civilized society, and they're going to be available on a time schedule. And people have people have time slots available, and for you to take advantage of it. So you have to actually you have to get up and go for it. Not You can't even say, well, you know what, I don't feel like it. My body isn't quite up to it all the time. You sort of have to just go with the flow to sort of get into it and seize those opportunities and do your best to take advantage of them to manifest your natural gift. Right? Now, the quest for knowledge in primitive society, that would it's an affront of primitive society. The idea is you accept the body of knowledge that's germane to the order of that society, and you accept it. You don't self-consciously question it. You don't move outside of it. You accept that body of knowledge, and that body of knowledge allows you self-respect. It allows you respect for your culture. It allows you respect for nature, right? Regardless of what it is, regardless of the veracity of the facts. That's not as important as the idea that you live in spirit. You respect a creator. You live in respect, with respect for yourself, or you live with respect for your culture and others around you. You live with respect for nature, and so that body of knowledge does that for you. And so the idea is you don't seek more and more knowledge, because then that presents a restless state of self, and an insecure self, and a kind of identity that would not fit you in the structure and order of society. But in civilized society, it is important to search for knowledge, right? It is the quest for knowledge that first brought man in, into so into the state of flesh, of civilized existence. Because remember, it's not the tree. The evil tree is the tree of knowledge of good and evil, right? Because once man starts adopting it, he's going to be seeking knowledge, right? But once you get into that state, you have to actually now seek knowledge and try to understand more and more, because as civilization is growing and developed, knowledge, knowing becomes important. Knowing what's discovered, getting to know yourself, right? Knowing more so you can communicate more better with society. Knowing more so you can manage the society better, manage your relationships with nature better, knowing more to get so that you can come to understand yourself better and better, knowing more that you can get even closer to God. So what you have to realize, that knowledge, the quest for knowledge, becomes more important, becomes a value once you're in civilized existence. That means that ignorance in civilized existence is not acceptable. All right. Now, along with the quest of knowledge, we'll talk about the interpretation of knowledge also, and how that gets to be played out once we get into um, civilized modes of living, right? Um, so let's move on to today's lesson proper, today's discussion. So now, if you read Genesis, you realize there are two areas of agreement that I mean that I see it that we can pick out in terms of the Genesis story and science. One is the approximate location of man's appearance, right? Um, Basically, in the Horn of Africa, northeast Africa, and so they both agree that man first appeared in that region, right? Northeast Africa, Middle East area, which is really Africa, because the Suez Canal is an unnatural barrier, really. So really, Northeast Africa, around that area, we have the Garden of Eden, or the specific area that both Genesis and science in general would agree that man first appeared on Earth. Also, there's a basic agreement in terms of the sequence of appearance of biological life, organismic life, right? Um, both they both agree that first there had to be trees, right? Then there had to be creatures in the oceans. There had to be creatures in the air, then animals on the land, right? And so there's a basic sense of agreement in terms of the sequencing of events of organismic life, right? Biological life appearing on Earth. So there are those areas of agreement, and those areas of agreement might actually point to some veracity to the Genesis story, right? Or not might. They point to the veracity of the Genesis story. Here's what that here are the misconceptions now that people might say might undermine the value of the story. The first thing that I might mention here is time, which I had mentioned before, because in the Bible it's saying, and God created this or that, and that was a day, right? And so immediately, it triggers off in our mind the 24-hour cycle of a day that we're used to, right? And so when we're reading, for instance, that and the evening and the morning were the fourth day, like in Genesis chapter 1 verse 19, after God says in chapter 17 and 18, and God set them the lights to rule in the firmament of heaven, to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good, and the evening and the morning were the fourth day. So when we hear day, what we're thinking, oh, day, like a 24-hour cycle that we're used to. We get up in the morning, the sun shines, and night comes, and then the next morning the sun shines again, and that is a day to us, and we're immediately associating that notion with what's in Genesis. Well, the a day really in Genesis is like a day that is like as time would be measured by primitive man. It's measured by events, right? It's the event, it's the creation of the light, of these lights, that marks a day in God's eyes. We're looking at Genesis from God's eyes. The creation of these lights in the heavens, that marks a day. So when that's done, that's a day that right there, that's done. One day, because that never existed before. Other than before that, there was just a routine, right? And once that creation comes in, it becomes part of a routine of nature, of physical existence. It is now present. Then when God then creates the animals, and says this is another day. So like let me just read from Genesis chapter 20, right? So after the fourth day, God said, let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life, and fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven. And God created great whales and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let the fowl multiply in the earth. And the evening and the morning were the fifth day. The creation of those creatures represents a day to God, because they never existed before. So creating them and having them exist now represents a day, and they're now a part of the routine of nature. Right? They're in nature, they're part of the existence of nature. Alright? Now, mind you, if we were able to see this all and to witness it, we might be seeing periods of thousands of years, millions of years, that God is actually bringing forth these creatures, right? If we're to gather it through our reckoning, in terms of a factual basis that's very important to us, in terms of the facts of it, we might be looking at it over millions of years. But the truth is, it can't happen. None of that stuff can happen. You're not going to have fishes just appear in the ocean and birds just appear in the skies unless God ordains it. So what if we were able to look at it while it was happening? We just see fishes appearing in the ocean and birds appearing in the skies. God has to ordain it, and once He ordains it, that's the day in His eyes. That's done. Okay. So each day is demarcated by events. All right, let's move on. Now, the creation of man is another thing that might bring up some sort of contention in terms of interpreting Genesis, because in chapters 1, it seems as if God created both of them, man and woman, at the same time, right? Where it says, and God said in Genesis chapter 1 verse 26, and God said, let us make man in our own image, after our own likeness. And chapter and verse 27, so God created man in his own image, in the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. Now, that seems as if God created them at the same time, but when we get into chapter 2, Genesis chapter 2, we see that God created Adam first, the man first, and then later on, he made Eve out of Adam's rib. He took Adam's rib and made Eve. So, well, how do we reconcile that? Well, what you have to realize is that what's provided in chapter 1, right? What's documented in chapter 1 is a panoramic view of existence. It's this general sketch of how God created existence, right? It's a bird's eye view. Here's how things went, right? Generally, right? There are more details to this. To each step we can go, but you can provide infinite details, but that's not important. What God wants is for you to see the sketch, the general sketch of what He's doing, the panoramic view of what He's doing. Because in chapter 2, He hones in on the creation of man. That's what it. So when in chapter 1 it says He created both of them, yeah, He created both of them, but He did create Adam first and then Eve, but He didn't get into that detail. That detail wasn't issued there, because that chapter isn't about getting into the details proper. It's just providing a sketch. Chapter 2 now is getting into the detail of man's creation, and man's creation in terms of woman, because there are points that are going to be scored here, right? Man's relationship with woman is going to be established. Why is God why is God creating woman? He looked at the man and decided that the man needed a companion to meet his needs at his intellectual conscious level for his companionship. So that the point is made that woman is brought in to man to be his wife for his sense of completion as a person. that he's not complete within in and of himself, that the woman is brought in for his completion, for companionship, for intellectual challenge and stimulation, right? So that's why God brought in a conscious creature outside of his being, right? Another conscious creature, which is a projection of himself to be a companion unto himself, right? So that there's a point being made. That's why that detail is focused on, right? And the other thing with the creation of man, that you notice in chapter 2, there is something else that's pointed out. Another detail that's not pointed out in the first chapter is that that um that God was issuing a warning and an advice at the same time, that man should feed off the tree of life, right? Feed off the body of God, the spirit. Man should live in spirit and not feed off the tree of knowledge of good and evil, not live in flesh, its flesh, right? So there's a point being made there. So there are some points being scored in the detail of the creation of man that's being addressed in Genesis chapter 2. Now, let's move on. Now, the creation of animals, that might also seem like contradictory if you look at Genesis chapters 1 to Genesis chapter 2. In Genesis chapter 1, the animals were created before man, but in chapter 2, it seems as if man was created and the animals were brought to him as companions for him to name them, right? Now, the truth is that what happened is the picture in Genesis chapter 1 in terms of the sequence of events is still correct. What's being pointed out in chapter 2 is the reason for for the creation of animals, that the animals were created specifically for man's companionship. Before God was preparing the physical realm for man, he was setting it up for man. Even the animals that were there were being created for man's companionship. And that's what's pointed out in Genesis chapter 2. The lights in the skies that God has put it up, even before man came, he said they were for signs and for seasons. Who are they signs and for seasons for? Mainly for man. Of course, all the animals use them, but man's reading them is going to be important to his existence. Okay, so God is ordaining the physical world for man, and so he's creating these animals, and even though he created them before man, he's creating them for man's companionship upon the earth. So man is going to have companions in terms of his behavioral, physical body, which, right, in terms of animals to relate to, and he's going to have companions in terms of his fellow man. All right, to challenge him intellectually, to stimulate him intellectually, and to complete each other's life upon the earth. All right. Now, this theory, the theory of evolution, is the other one that is a theory that man sort of uses to undermine the idea of Genesis, but it's a fallacious theory when you think of it, right? First of all, man has this notion of this idea of development, and that comes as a consequence of this notion of chasing after ego, of getting better and better and better. This idea of evolution is falling within the framework of that system of thought. It's not that that's what happened in nature, it's just how man interprets the world. Civilized man interprets the world, that things are getting better and better and better. Or because he sees himself as getting better and better and better. Remember, the way man addresses the world is the way he addresses himself. So if he thinks of himself as on this path of getting better and better, and all history must be about that, which in actuality it's about degeneracy, right? It's a degeneracy from his primitive tribal forms, but he sees it in terms of his twisted mind as him getting better and better and better. So then he's seeing this nature as operating in that way, that nature must be, animals appearing on the earth and their life must be about getting better and better and better. That's not the case. Nature works off systems. It's systematic. Okay, there's no getting better and better and better. No, some scientists might argue, well, the Earth wasn't always the same as it was, billions of years ago or millions of years ago, and so it's getting better and better. No, no, that's just natural process of growth. That's like stars, right? The stars aren't getting better and better and better because they grow, they're born, they grow, they die. It's like a child that's being born. The child is born a human being, and it grows and grows and grows as a human being to an adult and eventually dies. That's just life cycles. But that there's no development, as to say, changing outside of the total system of who you are. The chimpanzees don't change outside of of their systems of reproducing chimpanzees. They don't become men. They don't become human beings. They remain as chimpanzees. All right. It's this notion that man has in himself of better than and getting better, that he's imposing, he's viewing existence and nature through those eyes, through that prism, and think that nature is operating that way. Nature doesn't operate that way. All right. Then I'll get into more discussion of the theory of evolution and challenge it further on. You'll see more challenges in the book, but there's always this chicken and egg question that remains, right? First of all, if they're talking about species coming from other species, right, before, and other species before that, and so there's this interspecies transformation that's going on to create this variety of species, and everything keeps going, regressing back in time, then you'd have to explain, where did the first species come from, or if everything came from one cell, what did that come from? How did that come about? All right, but anyway, let's leave that for another time. The chicken and egg question is always an issue. What came first, the chicken or egg? There's no evolution there. That's a systematic functioning. The chicken lays the egg um, hatches to become a chicken, and the chicken then lays the egg, and that's just order. Which one would come first in that notion, right? How do you evolve to that? Right? You just have to have a chicken that lays an egg, and an egg that produces a chicken. God made it that way. That's it. Um, Now, there's this also chicken and egg question when we get down even to the first cell. Which one came first? Is it the proteins that generated the cell, or the cell that generated the proteins? Right? Is it the proteins that made the DNA that came first, or the DNA that made the proteins? Right? Or whatever it is. Is it what came first? Is it the cell mechanism that created the DNA or the RNA to that or is it the DNA or the RNA that came first? And how would that how could there be any kind of systematic function if anything is in some kind of singularity? Right? If there's just a single strand of DNA, how does it get to be a whole cell? Right? Just hanging around, and how does the whole cell just fall into place and just gets into systematic function? You get into this issue of the chicken and egg. Nature operates off systems. The system of creating, of generating life has to be in place. That God has to make it. God has to determine the system there. And remember, when in the earlier videos, I also spoke about program. These are programmatic ways of functioning. The systems that are in place are programmatic ways of functioning. God has to establish that program. Okay? Now, DNA is evidence that they find isn't evidence of evolution. It's just evidence of order. There's just order in all life, right? That this DNA is in all organisms, right? All creatures, right? So that's just order in creation. It doesn't. And we spoke about order before. It represents order, not evolution. Things are right, right. That whatever creature there is, they're going to produce their very own kind. They're not going to produce some other kind. They produce their very own kind of creatures. That's a systematic way of functioning. That's how nature functions, of systems and systematic ways. There's no improving to a better system. If there are lots of changes within the system, such right, what's going to happen is that the whole system is going to collapse. You're not going to get a better and better product. Right? If your body as a human being starts experiencing a lot of changes genetically and stuff like that, what's going to happen is you're going to die. You're not going to become a better human being. Okay? You're not going to become better physically, right? Because there's systematic ways of operating. It's best not to tamper with systems or imagine that they can be tampered with. It's just like man observing nature. Nature operates systematically. There are systems in place that God put in place. Geological systems, ecological systems, those are in place. It's best not to tamper with them or to imagine that those are evolving systems. The only change that's ever going to occur, and for any of those systems to change and to be and stability to be maintained, God himself has to do it. Once man gets in there and tries to alter any of those systems or try to inject himself improperly, he's going to be destroying and harming them, which is what's happening now. So we need to get out of this notion of us developing and getting better and better, right? We're having this notion allowing us to damage systems that are in operation. Nature never evolved to any better and better system. The systems have to be put in place. You notice what happened in Genesis chapter 1. God brought in the animals. He said, let the creatures, let the birds populate the skies. Let the fishes populate the ocean. He's establishing systems with those creatures. Okay? The fishes don't evolve to the birds. Then he said after let the animals occupy the dry land. The creatures, the animals in the sea, and the fishes in the sea aren't going to be occupying the dry land. They're contented in the sea. They're sea creatures. That's how God made them. Okay, and systems are in place. It's not. We should stop. Get out of. We need to get out of this mentality, where this better than mentality that doesn't operate in nature, and stop imposing ourselves upon nature in terms of our views. Okay, nature operates in very systematic ways, very programmatic ways. God established it. What we need to do at this point is rather come to that understanding and see how we can best fit ourselves in nature. Okay? No evolution. No getting. If there's any better that we need to get at this point in time is to see how we can get better at being suitable to nature. And being suitable to even our nature. Being suitable to our fellow man. Being suitable to God. Okay, so evolution isn't a reality. Things right things operate systematically, and they don't come out of their systematic function. They remain in their systematic function because that's how life operates within cycles and system. You come out of that systematic function, then you get death. You don't get better life. All right, we'll end it there today. Be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel for more videos. Like this video, share it. Remember to click that bell, so when the notification bell on YouTube, so that when I come out with more videos, you're aware of them and you can check them out. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to converse with you, or to discuss this philosophy of Darwinism, to counter Darwinism, but Darinism, or Darinism after my name. All right. Thank you. Until next time. Ta-ta.